So welcome everyone, and thank you for joining today's webinar. My name is Elizabeth Shearer. I'm the network coordinator with ClimateWest, and I'll be the moderator for today's webinar. This is the second in a three-part webinar series, which aims to take you through the climate adaptation journey using free tools and resources developed under the Manitoba Climate Resilience Training program. We're pleased to be offering this training as a collaboration between the Manitoba government and ClimateWest. Recordings of this webinar and the whole series will be available on the ClimateWest website. Next, I would like to offer a land acknowledgement to everyone on the call today. ClimateWest work occurs in the traditional land of many Indigenous nations and covers the territories of Treaties 1 through 8 and 10. I'd like to acknowledge where I live here in Treaty 1, the traditional ancestral lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Nunavik, Anishinaabe, Dakota, and Dene, also the homeland of the Métis Nation. I'd also like to acknowledge Treaty 3, specifically Shoal Lake 40, where our water supply is from, and Nelson River, Treaty 5, that supplies over 70% of electricity here in Manitoba. At ClimateWest, we deeply respect and honor the treaties and Indigenous ways of knowing. We're committed to the ongoing work of truth and reconciliation and exploring ways to respectfully weave these knowledges into our climate work. We encourage you to take time to learn about and reflect on the Indigenous lands where you live. A colleague has posted in the chat nativelands.ca, and you can explore using your map location and wherever your organization is based to learn what Indigenous lands you're on today. Next, I'll give a brief overview of our time together today. I'll start with an overview of ClimateWest. We're your regional climate service provider and host of this webinar. I'll pass it to the Manitoba Department of Environment and Climate Change, who will dive into the climate preparedness we'll dive into conduct the CVRA specifically today. And we've also set aside some time at the end for questions. So I would encourage you throughout the webinar, you can add your questions using the Q&A box. So that's different than the chat box. If you want us to be able to see all of your questions, I encourage you to use the Q&A function at any point. So without further ado, I'll give you a bit of intro of ClimateWest. We're a nonprofit organization. We provide free and reliable climate services across the Prairie region, and we're supported by the provincial governments of Manitoba, Alberta, and Saskatchewan, and at a federal level by the Environment and Climate Change Canada. We are part of a national network you can see across the country here who are working in partnership with the Canadian Centre for Climate Services to help Canadians adapt to our changed and changing climate. Our vision for ClimateWest is connecting communities, businesses, and nonprofits so that they are equipped to thrive in the face of a changed climate and meet the needs of their communities using the best science, expertise, and training that is tailored to meet their needs. So what does ClimateWest do? We're driven by a shared belief and commitment to collaboration and inclusive decision-making in climate resilience building. On the screen, you'll see some keywords that demonstrate what we do or describe what we do. So we share climate resilient information and resources that are reliable, credible, and regionally relevant. If you want to explore our website, a colleague was just entering it into the chat there. We are a connector. We connect people to resources. We connect people and people together. And we also connect information to action. We connect and tackle complex ideas and make them as accessible and relatable to a variety of audiences. So we can help you find local climate data, understand its implication, and provide guidance on how to integrate climate data into your decision-making. We have a large library of resources on our website, and one of those resources is understanding using climate data guide. So it's understanding your climate risks, and understanding those risks start with having good climate data. With a focus on the Prairie provinces, our climate data guide shows you where to find it for free and how to use it when planning for your changing climate. So check out that guide at any point and a number of other resources on our website. After this webinar, you're free to reach out to us. You can connect with us by phone, email. We have a help desk that is we're ready to answer any of your questions throughout the year. And I invite you to scan the QR code on your screen. You can sign up for our monthly newsletter and be kept in the know about the latest resources, events, and training to help you advance climate resilience in your community. I'll pass it over to the Manitoba government next, and I'll hand it over to Elaine Fox and Alex Bourne from the Climate Preparedness and Communications Branch of the Manitoba Department of Environment and Climate Change, Climate Action, and Energy Innovation Division. Over to you, folks.
Good morning. Can I have the next slide, please? Perfect. Thank you very much, everyone, for showing up this morning. And thank you, Liz, for going through that very complicated aspect of what department am I in, what division am I in, and what branch am I representing. So let's get started. Next slide, please, the webinar outline. So we'll talk a bit about the MCRT process, which is the Manitoba Climate Resiliency Training. We'll do a quick recap of webinar 1, which was Climate Preparedness 101. We'll look at Manitoba's climate adaptation planning process. And also, why do we do a vulnerability and risk assessment? Then the stages. 1, starting the whole process and the considerations you need to make. Stage 2, vulnerability and risk assessment, and we've broken it into 3 parts. And then key takeaways we hope you have from this webinar itself. So next slide, please. Manitoba Climate Resiliency Training progress. So it just didn't start now. It's actually got a bit of a longer legacy. There's 2 worlds to climate, and it's one of emissions reduction, and the other one is adaptation or resiliency building and being prepared for how we have actually already changed the climate because of our emission activities for the last 100 years. So in 2008-9 through 2018, we were basically focused on municipalities and other decision makers through the Prairie Regional Adaptation Collaborative that was also partnered with the NRCan at the national level to make people understand what is coming forward for climate change. How do they adapt to these activities? What should they be thinking about? That morphed into BRACE, which is building regional adaptation capacity and expertise. And that part focused more on the professions that support those decision makers. So you may have a council, you may have a business owner who, this is what I want to do, but if they don't have the engineers and planners and other support professions, it's kind of hard to get that idea moving forward. So that was the second phase of our focus for training. Then through 2022, Manitoba continued on after the BRACE program stopped to look at training. We see that as a very important component that the province can bring to the table. The federal government is much more expertise at providing raw data and all of that complexity, but we're more able to help you with how do you make these decisions? How can we support you with different types of tools? So one component of that training is vulnerability, risk, and needs assessment. So that's what we've been focusing on for the past while. And then the third is adaptation planning itself. One of the things you should know and why we partnered today with ClimateWest is they're a bit of a legacy from the PRAC, in the sense it allows the 3 provinces and the federal government to have a platform to have discussions about climate adaptation on the prairies. Next slide, please. So this is the 3 many of you may have attended at the Climate Preparedness 101. We're now in how to conduct a vulnerability and risk assessment. And then next week, we're going into climate adaptation and explaining that a bit more. Next slide, please. Let me recap what happened last week. So basically, we wanted to identify that human activities are increasing greenhouse gas emissions in the Earth's atmosphere and are driving global temperature rise. Models have clearly demonstrated that Canada's climate has changed because of global temperature increase, impacting all regions of our country and it also provides opportunities. With risk comes opportunities as well. We have and will continue to experience increased frequency and severity of climate events. When we talk about global warming, it's not the temperature just is increasing on a daily basis. What it is doing is changing the frequency and severity of climate events or weather events. The climate will stabilize once we achieve and maintain net zero global greenhouse gas emissions. That's a point where it kind of locks in a certain type of climate that we can build to, that we can prepare for. Whereas if we don't get that lock in, we don't really know what the future is going to bring. It'll just keep getting more severe and more frequent. We will not revert back to past climate conditions, and we'll adapt, and we'll have to adapt to the new realities. There was a misconception for a while that, oh, well, we'll just go back. It's climate change, so we can change back. Nope, it is changed, and it's not going back. Inaction also is more costly than taking action. Many of the things that we've looked at for return on investment is that, the most reasonable and conservative one is for every dollar you invest today, you're saving $5 in future costs on payouts, reparations, damages. It's important to consider climate change risks and opportunities in your decision making. Climate services are available in Manitoba and across the Prairies region and Canada to support climate-smart decision-making and resilient infrastructure design. And my final point from our takeaway was being prepared for a changing climate helps to build resilience for a safe, healthy, and prosperous Manitoba. Next slide, please. So how we've started for Manitoba as the government is to create templates and guidebooks. And here are 4 that we've looked at, one on climate vulnerability and risk assessment. How to use the Climate Atlas of Canada. It has a lot of great information. It's been a partnership with the Prairie Climate Center out of the University of Winnipeg since its inception. And the next workbook is Climate Adaptation for Manitoba, and then Climate Adaptation Planning and Manitoba Communities. So some of the guidebooks are overviews telling you how to use these things, and some of them are just templates themselves, or a workbook to go through. Next slide, please. So Manitoba's climate adaptation planning process. Many of you have seen variations on this of how do you start, what do you go to next, and then it's cyclical because planning should never be, oh, I've got the perfect plan and now I'm putting it on the shelf and I don't have to look at it again. No, you learn things as you implement things. So just get started in the process. And this section, we're dealing with the vulnerability and risk assessment, trying to identify how all of these different events might impact your community or might not impact your community. And then you can put them into adaptation planning itself. And adaptation planning is an enhancer to the other planning and budgeting that you do. And once you start putting it into your own plans and your own budgets, you go to the implementation stage. And that's where you can learn a lot if you monitor it and evaluate it. And then you start the process over again of what should we be looking at? Many times if you take actions, you eliminate the risk that you originally thought was the largest or the highest in category because you've already made yourself protected from it. Next slide, please. So why do we do a vulnerability and risk assessment? Well, it promotes informed decision-making by providing evidence-based, data-driven information, ensuring your actions and policies are based on solid knowledge rather than assumptions. And many times because we did not have the data, a lot of us were making assumptions. And sometimes they were very good assumptions, but it really helps to have that backing of knowledge based in evidence. Moves your knowledge into actions. When you can really support what you understand about something, you can create actionable plans and strategies that minimizes those risks or creates a path to that opportunity and prepares for a changed climate. Supports targeted funding and budgeting. So having a vulnerability and risk assessment and knowing what's coming to you in the future allows you to really utilize your funding well, allows you to access other funding that is available out there, and creates a more conducive environment for budgeting long term. So another reason for VRA is increases desirability for external investment. If there are having a vulnerability and risk assessment in place is a structured approach to managing climate risk. Business, citizens, and investments, they all look at, well, this town of 10,000 has a nice plan, but it hasn't considered climate change. This town of 10,000, They've moved it into their development plans. The businesses understand what is coming their way because they can look at a document that says this is what we understand our climate is changing to and what we're doing in order to make ourselves better prepared for it. So it makes you more desirable to, when you have a vulnerability and risk assessment. It proves that you're thinking about climate and you're taking action. So you become the better one for external investment. Helps create safe, stable, and sustainable communities. Everyone wants to live in a city or a town that is protected from whatever it be. Maybe wildfires, might be a flood, might be a drought. You want to be in a community that can weather those events. Next slide, please. So one of the other drivers that we've looked at for vulnerability and risk assessment has been the financial sector, and they've been changing quite a bit. So we look at the Bank of Canada, the Bank of England, a number of the world banks have been looking at their financial system, and they're incorporating climate change right into their templates. And it's not just the physical issues they're looking for, such as extreme weather events, but it's transition issues, we call them, such as policy changes. Did you have to have different bylaws? Are you having different fees because of what's happening with the climate? Alarms are also sounding on the need for global financial systems to account for and disclose climate risks. So it's not just at the local level, it's at the national and international level as well. Some of the other financial rating institutions like Moody's, they're incorporating climate risks and opportunities on businesses and governments and how they affect revenues, costs, reputations, and impacts for commercial lenders. So, this is how you're able to borrow money on the open market. If you suddenly aren't considering all these things, your reputation as a good place to invest might be damaged. Same with venture capital interests. They're looking for that resiliency, as we've talked about before. What we're seeing is innovative financial tools coming forward. One of them is called a CAT bond or a catastrophe bond. And what it is you buy the bond, and if you meet certain criteria of a weather event or such, or a catastrophe, they pay you out the bond. So it can, sometimes it's good because it covers off the costs that you have from the catastrophe. Sometimes it's excellent because you met the requirements of that, but you had protected yourself from it. So now you have money from that bond to go on to another item. Green bonds as well. They help support the building of adaptive or natural infrastructure or green infrastructure, or just hard infrastructure that protects communities. The other one is we're seeing insurance industries also step away from certain things. We saw Desjardins in Quebec step away from giving out mortgages in flood zones. And the insurance industry has signaled that their payouts are actually starting to outstrip their revenues that they create from us all buying insurance. So that model is kind of changing over. And how do we compensate for that? And that's why we also see the disaster financial assistance. They are changing as well. And they used to always be, we pay you after the event, and you have to build back to exactly what it was. Well, we're learning that that's not necessarily the most intelligent way of building back. Maybe we should build it back to a higher standard that locks in a better protection level than before. And so they're amending themselves to say, yes, if you built dikes in an emergency because of an event, keep the dikes there, make them permanent, rather than rip the dikes out and go back to the lower level of area. So this is actually putting a lot of pressure on governments, local, provincial, federal, to think about how they're using their finances and how to go forward. Next slide, please. Integration of adaptation planning and into hazard mitigation planning. Many of you do both. And what we're working very well with emergency management organization to blend the two. Because hazard planning is climate planning. Planning for the flood is planning for the flood, whether you call it a climate event or a hazard event. So there are shared responses to these impacts for us. Now, hazard planning, you might also have to look for a chemical spill that's not caused by climate. But there are incremental things that are caused by climate that EMO does not respond to, like heat waves or a drought. So this is how we have our own respective hazards or impacts that occur. And then we have very much an area where we share impacts, and it's within both of our realms. Next slide, please. So this slide is to represent that we don't want 9,000 plans, and we don't want you working on multiple things. What we want you to do is take your hazard vulnerability assessment and your climate vulnerability assessment and move it into your development plan zoning bylaws. They are tools to help you make decisions or think about things so that when you get to your larger plan for your community or your business plan, you can incorporate these items into it. So around it, you see how some municipalities have used it before or other tools that are out there for people to use. But what we're trying to do is just make the most informed final plan and budget for whether you're a community or a business. Next slide, please. So this is our first stage, and I can't reiterate it enough that just start. There's always, in the perfect world, there's 9 worksheets to fill out. I've never seen anyone fill out all 9. And don't think you have to, sometimes the enemy of good is perfection. So just start where you have the information, what information you can put into it. And it will build on it as you go along the process. And over time, you'll suddenly say, "Oh yeah, I know where to get a community profile now," or "Yeah, I think we have vision and goals. Maybe we need to develop objectives." So look for leadership, and it can be on your council, it can be in your community organizations, or individuals that are informed and want to help and participate. Budget for your plan and its implementation. You need to have people working with you. So you need a committee, so you need at least a coffee and a cookie budget in order to get them to the meeting to, talk about the issues that you have going forward. I can read all of the worksheets for you, but I think all of you are able to do that. And it's just for considerations. So the ones that you're able to fill out, start them. Next slide, please. Too early in the presentation to start losing my voice. So stage 2, because that was stage 1, looking at all those considerations. Stage 2 is the vulnerability and risk assessment. And the purpose is to understand how a changing climate will impact your community. We'll help you create a priority list of climate risks to prepare for and include in your adaptation plan or budget. So number 1 is climate hazard assessment. 2 is climate impact and consequences. 3 is the risk assessment in total, looking at it. Climate risk is the interaction of hazards, exposure, and vulnerability. And as I may have alluded to earlier, sometimes, like Winnipeg built a floodway, built Shellmouth, built the Portage Diversion. So it actually took a very extreme flood in comparison to the 1950 flood to threaten Winnipeg. Otherwise, we are taking very large floods and they're not impacting it. So our vulnerability to a flood of that scale is gone. So our exposure is reduced. The hazard still exists at that size, but we're not vulnerable to it any longer. Next slide, please. Oops. So in the guidebook, because for climate adaptation, climate preparedness, we're all using a number of different words, and we sometimes use them differently. Just even between emergency management and ourselves and infrastructure, they talk about disaster mitigation, whereas we talk about climate adaptation. Same thing, no difference in it at all. So that's why I really encourage you to look at the glossary and how we're defining it so that we can all start talking to each other in the same kind of language. The 4 big ones that we want to bring to your mind is climate hazard, a climate-related event that can put infrastructure, natural ecosystems, social systems at risk and produce negative consequences, such as a flood. A climate impact, the effects of a climate hazard, either currently or anticipated, on infrastructure, natural ecosystems, and social systems. Because you had a flood, you have the potential for contaminated wells. So that's the impact, contaminated wells from the hazard of a flood. Climate consequences, something that occurs because of a climate impact. So we now have contaminated wells. Well, there's an increased use of the emergency room because people are getting stomach bugs. So climate risk is the potential for negative or positive consequences for infrastructure, natural ecosystems, and social systems due to a climate hazard. So it's likelihood and severity that you're looking at for climate risk. So that's how we define those four. Next slide, please. I think all of us have kind of felt a number of the hazards that we have occurring. So examples of climate-related hazards: flooding, drought, wildfire, wind events have been increasing and widening across the Manitoba province. So we're seeing them much higher up into the Interlake than we had traditionally seen. We're also looking at winter roads. We're losing them when they're over water bodies. So we're having to change the patterns to get them over for all season roads, to get them onto land. We're looking at things like slow onset, like invasive species such as zebra mussels or Lyme disease. And the other thing is low levels of water. If we're having a drought, if we're having heat waves, water is dropping, which impacts our economy as well because that's our generation of hydro. So there's a number of items that are going that way. So the headlines are out there. One of the things we also have with a changing climate is extended growing seasons. So, and we might have different crops that we can put into the ground. We also have opportunities for increased recreation, whether it be, keeping parks open longer, splash pools into September because we're still having a big heat wave and we want kids to be able to cool off. The other thing that we look at is creating more reliable supply lines. If things are open, if we have certain climate conditions, our supply lines might be better in place. The other aspect is there's eco-anxiety and stress. If anyone's ever been through a flood or a fire, they know that that can really give an impact to yourself. And how do you deal with it? And we're also seeing it emerge a lot in young people, this eco-anxiety. What is my future going to be if we don't get climate change under control? Next slide, please. So climate hazard assessment is the first step. It's to identify those hazards that already affect or will affect your community and understand how the climate hazards are predicted to change. Are you going to have more extreme heat? Are you going to have less? Are you going to have more wildfires? We're seeing a difference. A lot of times in Manitoba, our perspective was wildfires are those things that rage up north. But as we have drier conditions, we're seeing a lot more wildfires to the south, where there's more structures and people. And you can't just pick up Brandon and put them in a hotel somewhere else. You have to have different strategies for that. Next slide, please. So there's two types of events when we're talking about climate hazards. One are those single events, which is easy for us to all identify. Winds, like tornadoes, heavy snowfalls, lightning, ice accumulation, heat waves, thunderstorms, floods. Then there are the slow onset, and these are things like frost-free periods, warming winters, and the loss of extreme cold. We saw that with pine beetles in BC. They weren't dying off in the winter and therefore were causing real havoc in their forests. Length of growing seasons can be changing and what you are able to do in that period of time. Changes to stream flows and ice breakups and the dynamics of that. Where are we going to get more fragile ice in certain water bodies? Diseases transmitted by animals or insects. Because of this changing to the climate, some species can migrate more to a time, but it also allows different animals to get closer or pushes them closer to humans, and the jump of diseases from them to between species can occur. And then freeze thaw cycles. I think almost every Manitoban has seen what it does to our roads and highways as far as frost boils, potholes, etc. So single events, sudden, discrete, occur in short periods of time such as hours and days. Slow onset are gradual changes over extended periods, often years and decades. Next slide, please. So again, these are some of the examples of a single event and the types of damages that they do and the long-term environmental changes that we can see. Next slide, please. So what do you do knowing all of these things? You identify trends in emerging climate. And one of the things we developed, we have the manual for you to use not climatedata.ca, the Climate Atlas. But we thought with talking to municipalities and to others that maybe we could have a prepared document that scales it down to where you have to make a decision and also provides a professional analysis of certain attributes for the 4 seasons within your boundaries. So we're calling them climate cards. And it's created out of the Prairie Climate Center through their climate scientists. It's based on the Climate Atlas itself and is updated as they update the Climate Atlas. And it allows you to have reliable information on how climate is changing. If you have an investment prospectus, this is something you can add to it. It shows that you understand or are aware of how things are changing in your area. So I would, encourage you to go to climateatlas.ca and see what they have, or look all around the Prairie Climate Center's website. They have certain information in regards to that seasonal change. Next slide, please. So if I dig into that right side of the lovely front page of the other slide, this is what we do. So typical hottest day. And then we give you 3 scenarios of carbon emissions. So there's the low. We've done a lot of things. Everybody's driving EVs. We've all switched from burning fossil fuels. This is how it will impact. We'll go from 33 degrees up to 35 degrees. Mean is we've done some things, but it's still increasing global temperatures, 38. And high scenario is we've done nothing. It's just business as usual and how it's impacting. So typical coldest day might be minus 37 in the recent past. If we are doing a lot for emission reductions, it's 34 degrees. If we're just doing so-so, it's minus 29. And if we're in the high percentile of business as usual, it's at 23. Now, a lot of times we go, oh, wow, it's really nice to lose cold days. But a lot of our infrastructure, and we're really seeing that in the north and in the larger north of Northwest Territories and the Yukon, they're having buildings subside, rail lines begin to become spongy. There's a lot of things that happen. We are a country that has predicated a lot of our infrastructure on cold, on permafrost. Next slide, please. So what is our future climate? And so as we look at it, this is the United States, and all of these are kind of time points of when that climate will occur in Manitoba. And we use those stations and do forecasting, and this is from the Prairie Climate Center itself. And so we can see by 2081, we'll most likely have the same kind of climate here as they have in Missouri, Iowa, and Nebraska. And there's a fair change in what we have. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that we have the soil depths that they have there. As we get into more north into our province where the boreal exists, but it is a change in the temperatures that we'll have. Out at the lake, I have a number of Americans who are cottage owners around us, and they are from Iowa and Nebraska, and they're coming to Canada for the summer. Strange, but to escape the 110, 115 degree heat. So this is something to consider. Thank you, and I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Alex Bourne. Take it away.
Good morning. My name is Alexandra Bourne, and I also work in climate preparedness and communications with Elaine. And I am going to walk us through the vulnerability and risk assessment process. If I could have the next slide, please. So, the information that I'm going to show you in the next few slides is available in the Vulnerability and Risk Assessment Guidebook that Elaine has mentioned, and the worksheets are available in the Adaptation Planning document. Again, Elaine's mentioned these two documents, and they are available on the ClimateWest website. So I'm going to work through the steps that you need to take to do a VRA. So let's get started. The first step is to develop a list of your climate hazards. So as you're developing this list, you might want to ask yourself some questions. What weather phenomena or extreme event have occurred in your area over the past 30 years? Have you observed any recent trends in these events, the frequency or the severity? And are there any new potential hazards moving your way, such as invasive species? As you're developing this list for your municipality or your community, what you might want to do also is engage with people in your community, look through old newspapers, old records or archives to really get a sort of an accurate historical view of what has happened in your community and see how things are changing over the last few years. And what you could do is then go to the worksheet, which is available in your adaptation workbook, and fill out the climate hazard, whether it's a flood risk or whether it's a wildfire that occurred, and put down some information about the frequency that it's occurred, the magnitude, and the duration. So this is you collecting sort of a list of the climate hazards that might be impacting your community. Next slide. So creating that, now that you've created your list of your hazards, you want to define each hazard. And for an example that we have here is about heat waves. So what you want to look at is whether this hazard has changed, whether it's changed because the climate continues to warm, or whether it's been influenced by other weather patterns. So make note of some changes that you might be seeing. And this is where you would use the climate forecast cards that Elaine talked about, that Prairie Climate Center has provided. This tells you what your community is going to look like in future years. And so you can look and see the changes that might be occurring and that might have an impact on your hazard. Once you've looked through that, you might be able to put together a more defined statement for your hazard. So this example here, where we're talking about a heat wave, the statement that has been refined is that as average temperatures and the number of days above 30 degrees increase, the future heat waves are expected to increase to be 5 days longer and hotter than in previous years. So it'd be interesting for you to go through all your climate hazards that you have got on your list and define a statement about where you might be going in the near future based on the climate forecast for your community. Next slide, please. So that's the first step of your climate assessment is your list of hazards. The second step that we're going to look at is the impacts. So the purpose of this is to find the impacts for each hazard. There'll be multiple impacts for each hazard and then multiple solutions for each impact. So we really need to think at a larger collective area and how we're going to address this. It can also help you better understand the cause and effect of relationships between hazards, impacts, and consequences. So next up, we'll get more into the impacts. If we look at the next slide. Again, here's a worksheet from the work plan book. This gives you an opportunity to write down your climate hazard, how you're going to see your climate hazard change over the next while, look at your climate hazard statement, and then put down the number or multiple impacts that are going to occur because of this hazard. The example that we have on the screen, again, is the heat wave. And what we're going to see is more hot days and nights. We're going to see lower water supply, perhaps, loss of soil moisture, higher chance of wildfires, and a higher chance and worse of worse drought conditions. So this is really getting you to brainstorm sort of the impacts that might be occurring because of the hazard that you've listed. Next slide, please. So once you have your impacts, the next thing to think about also is the consequences. And as Elaine mentioned earlier, so your consequences are something that occurs in response to a particular climate impact. And here I'm going to give you another example other than heat waves. So we're going to talk about the hazard being drought, and your impact perhaps could be your crop failure, and your consequence could be the insurance claims that you're going to have to claim afterwards. So again, another there could be many impacts and many consequences for each one. Next slide, please. So as you're working through this exercise, there are a number of sectors to consider, categories and sectors for your community. What we've put on this slide is some questions that you can ask yourself to sort of get your mind going in that vein, so you can think about your different consequences. But really for your municipality, things you should be thinking about and sectors you should be considering is the community and the people. So you're going to be looking at, will this hazard that we're going to hit our community, what are going to be the impacts and consequences, in terms of hospitalization, mental health. You're going to think about your critical services. What is the impact on transportation in your community? Water, electricity, buildings and infrastructure. You're going to think about also your local economy. How is this going to support or impact other communities other categories or sectors along the way? Whether it's another business in the community, if you can't get to the grocery store, there's a flood, that's going to be another consequence down the road of the flood. You're going to look at your local economy, and of course, you're going to also look at the natural environment. So the guidebook lists all these categories and sectors for you to consider as you're working through this exercise of your vulnerability and risk assessment. And if we can go to the next slide, we'll continue with our example of the heat wave. You're going to be looking at your hazard, which is your heat wave, and looking at the consequences on each of these 5 categories or sectors: the community and the people, the critical services, the building and the infrastructure, your local economy, and your natural environment. And as you can see here, there are a number of consequences under each sector. We're going to see more cases of heat exhaustion and heat stroke. There could be a higher demand for emergency medical services. We could also see cracks in building foundations. There's going to be an effect on the local economy that perhaps we haven't thought about as consequences spread even further. And that could lead to things like financial pressures on the farmers and agricultural businesses, as well as impacts on tourism and other industries. And again, there's stresses, of course, that's going to happen on your natural environment, whether it's due to excessive heat and wildfires or flooding. And this, of course, is going to have impact on plant and animal life. So next slide, please. So once we've identified all of our climate hazards and we've looked at the impacts, what we really want to do is to assign a risk level to these climate hazards and prioritize them. Some of you might be familiar with this classic risk matrix, assessment matrix. And what we have here, it's called a heat map. You might have heard it being referred to as that. We have the likelihood of your hazard occurring on your y-axis, and you have the severity on the x-axis. So severity can range from sort of an insignificant all the way to catastrophic. And the idea behind these heat maps or assigning a risk level is to help you in your community prioritize the activities that you might be, or the initiatives that you might be taking in your community, the work that you're going to be doing, prioritizing your budget, looking at where your risks are, which are your more significant risks that you should have as a higher priority, and which ones maybe might come in as sort of a medium to low priority. So what you can do here, after we've looked at your hazards is that we want to assign levels of likelihood, which have definitions here in these tables here, and our severity, and plot it out on this heat map. So next slide, please. Here we're going back to our example of the heat wave. So what we're seeing when we look at the heat wave in a community as an example, that seniors and vulnerable communities will suffer from these heat waves, whether it's heat stroke or other illnesses. And you can assign a value based on the heat map that we saw in the previous slide of severity and the likelihood of it happening. Another consequence that we have here in the example is, say, the cancellation of outdoor events and sports gatherings. So again, the severity of that is lower than the effect, of course, on seniors and vulnerable population, and the likelihood of that happening also is probably less frequent. So once we have these numbers assigned to our hazards, that'll help us plot them out. And if you can see in the next slide, if we can move along, here's an example of how you can put all your hazards and assign a risk value to them. This will give you the opportunity to really look at your community and be able to prioritize your risks. The interesting thing that what we've found when we have done this, and a lot of people don't have this in mind, is that heat waves often have a higher consequences and higher mortality than, say, even a flood. And a flood is something that we see a lot in Manitoba that we're very familiar with. And we often put flood as our highest priority. But doing an exercise like this might shift your mind to think perhaps that, a heat wave in your community might be your priority for you to plan for and to budget for. So next slide, please. And again, this is all part of your risk management. So risk management, of course, is already occurring in your financial documents, in your audited statements. And so what we're doing by doing a vulnerability and risk assessment is incorporating climate into your risk assessment and your risk management that you're doing for your community. So the templates and the guidebooks that I've mentioned that are available on the ClimateWest website will help you decide which risks are low, high, or medium. And based on this, will help you to determine what you want to do in terms of your adaptation planning. And this is what we're going to talk about in the third webinar. So your key steps in your climate risk management are to assess how severe and likely the hazards might be for you and your community. You're going to have some hazards in your community that are going to be high risk, and other ones maybe that might not be as high risk, but something that you still want to consider for long-term planning. You're going to assess your impacts and your consequences that the climate hazard will have in your community. This is important, right? For your prioritization. And this will help you calculate the risk levels and priorities for your policies and your planning and your budget responses as you move forward in your adaptation planning and in your municipality's budget planning cycle. So next slide, please. So as we've mentioned, there's a lot of climate service organizations out there with a lot of great information that can help you as you work through a vulnerability and risk assessment. ClimateWest, who's hosting this webinar with us, and they host also all the documents that we've been referring to on their website. Other organizations that provide great information that will be helpful are the Prairie Climate Center. They have generated the climate forecast cards that will be very useful for you as you're going through this process. And that comes out of their Climate Atlas, which is available on their website. EcoWest is another organization that we work with closely, who do provide great services to help with climate adaptation planning and accessing funding for climate adaptation planning. ISD also provides great information, and of course the federal government, if you want to have a deeper dive into data, that's there available as well for you to look at. So next slide, I think I'm going to pass it on to Elaine to go over some key takeaways from this webinar.
Thanks, Alex. Good job. So some of the takeaways that we want you hopefully to think about after this seminar is that effective vulnerability and risk assessment requires the engagement of diverse stakeholders, including local communities, government agencies, Indigenous, private, and other sectors, to incorporate various perspectives. It helps to have a larger group when you're thinking about the approaches. A structured approach also helps examine the cause and effect relationship between these climate hazards, impacts, and consequences, fostering a more comprehensive and effective risk management process. Assessing climate risks also involves evaluating the likelihood and severity of climate hazards, as we've talked, and the impacts and consequences that will occur on various sectors, which helps to prioritize actions to mitigate these risks. That's the problem with doing a morning presentation. Can you use your words? VRA is also evidence-based. It's data-driven report verifying that you're considering climate change in your planning and decision-making. It's really important to outside sources to see that you're doing that. And finally, understanding your vulnerability and risks helps to build a resilience for a safe, healthy, and prosperous Manitoba. Next slide, please. I guess we're closing up. So now you're ready to go to move on to adaptation planning. So there's the cycle again. There's the book. Next slide, please. Our next webinar is going to be on March 19th. I believe it's at the same time, 10 a.m. to 11. And I hope that all of you will be able to attend it or be interested. And next slide. So thank you very much. And thank you, ClimateWest, for hosting this as well. And